EDGE23 is a decision science company that does things with data few others can. Its proprietary platform combines advanced data analytics, state-of-the-art machine learning and AI capabilities with a data science workforce unmatched in its sector experience and accomplishments. And the sectors it serves are those standing front and center in America's navigation through today's turbulent times. Defense and national security, intelligence, and homeland security are EDGE23's bread and butter, but its data science team extends to other agencies whose missions are central to America's competitiveness and security, a mix of agencies across the federal government. More than data analysis, EDGE23 strives for high-value information products directly connected to real-time decision-making. For nearly a decade, EDGE23 has opened this conference with a data-rich, provocative analysis complementary to each year's conference theme. EDGE23 is a member and partner of the Government Business Executive Forum, and its contributions to EDGE at CES, the EDGE Security Summit held each summer in San Diego, and select EDGE Series programs are a major value add to GBEF members and the GBEF annual agenda. The EDGE23 conference theme is Clear and Present Danger, Technology and Mission Performance in Troubled Times. Please welcome to the stage for the EDGE23 opening presentation and analysis, EDGE23 founder Eric Gillespie and President and Chief Executive Officer Tara Murphy Doherty.
Good morning, EDGE. Good morning, GBEF Executive Committee and members. It's so wonderful to be back, to see all of you again. As the video indicated, EDGE23 loves being here. I have to start off by first thanking Don Upson, thanking Sarah. You and your teams are amazing. This event is unparalleled, and we're honored to be here and looking forward to kicking off the discussion. I'll also mention that there's a paper on your tables, and this paper contains the detail. As you know, EDGE23 likes to get a little dense, very fitting with data and data analysis, and so you can follow along or you can review it after the talk, but the two align, and I think you'll find it interesting.
I'm going to start the conversation today by looking back a year ago when we were on the stage and talking about some of the threats that the nation's facing. For those of you who were here, this will resonate, and for those of you who were not, I'll do a quick recap for you from EDGE22. Last year we looked at 8 key metrics. We looked in a quantitative way at 8 drivers that determine national dominance in global power competition. And these are the 8 that we broke apart empirically and looked at how the US stacks up against some of our global competitors. Just a quick recap. This is one of the 8, or a couple of the metrics from the 8. This is the education metric. And on the left, you can see the United States. The orange boxes highlight where we sit. On the right, you can see China and see where China sits on a relative basis. And then if you just do the math, you can see in terms of size what the United States has in terms of educated people versus China and where the trend is headed. And again, across all of these 8 indicators, we did those kinds of analyses last year, which we shared here at EDGE and with all the GBF members. These are those 8 indicators and those 8 metrics for the United States plotted out over time. And you can very clearly see the ascension of the US and over the last couple of decades, its decline, again, quantitatively. Likewise, when you look at China, across the same 8 metrics, you can very clearly see the ascension of China. And again, no surprise to the people who were here last year. If you look at the relative standing of the United States as compared to other nations over a 400 or 500 year history, and look at those 8 indicators consolidated into a single metric, this is what it looks like. The United States is the blue line, China is the red line. And on a qualitative basis, this is the pattern. You can see over time how the UK overtook the Netherlands. You can see how the US overtook the UK. You can see how China is about to overtake the US. This is how we left things at the end of last year when we walked off stage. What we've done since then is ask a pretty simple question. How can you take the same data that underpins that analysis and use it to our advantage? Are there things in the data that we can look at and begin leveraging in order to try to change that trajectory? And that's what's in the document that you have, and that's what we're going to talk through today. Through this analysis that we did over the last year, we began bucketing historically into 5 eras how data and information has been used. The first era, early in history, if you look way back, things like merchants in the port of Athens, in this case, the Battle of Thermopylae, and how the complexion of the Battle of Thermopylae changed based on data. Data and information came from the commercial sector. It came from private entities who provided it to governments. If you fast forward, what we're calling the age of the diplomatic envoy, the same thing happened. The technology at the time was the printing press, among others, and governments, nation states, relied on commercial enterprise to provide the most current and relevant information for decision making. Fast forward yet again to the early industrial revolution. Technology was the telegraph, and governments began implementing and using technology to transmit and receive information at the speed of an electronic pulse. Fast forward again to the atomic era. This is Moffett Field in Silicon Valley in 1934. Most people don't know that Silicon Valley was originally called Microwave Valley because the companies that were there were SIGINT companies processing signal intelligence. IBM in San Jose in 1943, and you all know the history. JCR Licklider at MIT Lincoln Lab in the 60s. All of this led up to today. And today, the commercial data that's available across a wide swath of industries, which we'll talk about, makes things possible like tracking mass graves and the soldiers who committed those atrocities in Ukraine back to the point at which it happened, because a commercial entity has cell phone data that track the soldiers in the death squad. A commercial entity can put a spacecraft in the air, a CubeSat, and get higher fidelity imagery of the surface of the Earth than what most governments have, including ours sometimes. And these are oftentimes very small companies who are launching these spacecraft. A 20-year-old kid, college student, can track the private jet of the wealthiest human on the planet using the same kind of commercial data. And finally, treasuries and central banks around the world are grappling with the opacity of a currency into which they have no visibility or very limited visibility and almost no data. Looking at those 5 eras, the first 2 were driven by commercial data. It was private entities primarily and people in private entities who provided and supplied that information to government. The second 2 are where the government took over. And the technologies that were available could only be driven at scale by government. They were too large and the information was too vast to be processed by a private entity at that point. In the era that we're in today, the momentum has shifted back. So commercial entities today, the private sector, the companies represented in this room, today have the power again, and the data that's available that the government wants to transact are in the hands of the people and the companies here. This is the age of commercial data and machine learning, as we've called it. This is where we are right now. As we looked back over that period of time, over the last 400 or 500 years, we identified 13 key categories of commercial data that inform national security at this point in time today. These are all spelled out in the paper that you have in front of you, and there's lots of detail behind each one if you're interested in it. This is what we're up against. China has made very clear what their ambitions are for establishing a new global world order, and they're using data to do that. Unlike the US, China doesn't have to transact with their civilian sector. Civ-mil fusion means that they can just take the data from the civilian sector, which is exactly what they do, which means it's incumbent upon our government and the national security enterprise to engage with private sector entities to compete with China at this scale. New York Times headline from recently: and what we've seen over the last year, since we were last here on the EDGE stage, is the national security ecosystem is beginning to embrace commercial data. The reality is, the country that wins the data race wins the AI race. And as we've talked about multiple times at GBEF and EDGE, the country that wins the AI race wins the world. This is where we are now. As we were looking at the list of sponsors here at EDGE, the companies that everyone in the room represents, the Carahsoft vendors that are participating here today, those are the companies that have what could possibly be the greatest economic opportunity in a generation. This commercial data space and the technologies that underpin commercial data for national security right now are what's going to drive activity for the next decade. And that's where we are.
Eric, that might be the least depressing talk you've ever given at GBEF.
That's probably true.
I don't know if they're going to invite us back.
There's more. just wait.
Well, I want to talk more about the opportunity and specifically go through some of these data categories in the commercial data space that are what national security and American competitiveness are going to pivot on in the coming years. The first that I have to mention is government budget and acquisition data. The US federal government this year will spend $1.7 trillion. The Department of Defense alone will spend more than $850 billion of that. I know everyone in this room is as excited as I am that we can throw those numbers around authoritatively because we are no longer under a continuing resolution. That's not something you can take for granted in January anymore. One would think that with the enormous sums that we're talking about, that the spending would be tracked to the penny. But of course that isn't the case. And one of the most common challenges that we see the federal government facing is knowing what is being spent, by whom, and on what. Commercial data that investigates where the money goes at a granular level in every category with the metadata around the dollars spent, including to whom and on what technologies is available and is what will close this gap. Business relationships data unearths the complex relationships of entities around the world. Today, most federal government agencies are only looking at surface level connections. But we know that in the new normal we face with supply chain disruptions and with the fragility of global supply chains, that those relationships need to be better understood. Investment data is fundamentally the money that flows in and out of these companies. Understanding what the capital structure is, what the ownership structure is. This comes from publicly traded companies, their shareholder information, but it also can unearth insights, facts, trends in things like venture capital and private equity. Investment and capital flows that were previously thought to be too opaque are no longer so. Firmographic data is all of the metadata about the tens of millions of companies that are operating in the ecosystem that matters to national security, whether they're working with the federal government today or not. This touches on everything from the capital that we talked about, to ownership structure, to the entire corporate hierarchy associated with large companies that have dozens, at times hundreds of subsidiaries and associations around the world. Take TransDigm Group as an example. It has 466 different subsidiaries. TransDigm has a credit rating of 96 out of 100. But one of its suppliers has a credit rating of 61. That supplier, which I'll leave you to unearth in the paper and not call them out on stage, is critical across not just one, but several defense programs. Without the complete view of a corporate hierarchy that firmographic data can provide, understanding that that risk exists to a critical military program is impossible. Last year on this stage, we talked quite a bit about how the system that the federal government uses to harness American innovation and bring it into the federal ecosystem is completely broken. The reality is that most companies that are working with the federal government are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the American innovation system has to offer. The companies that are not your traditional defense entrants or not your traditional federal vendors are typically seeking out the federal marketplace on their own. But the vast majority of innovative startups in the United States aren't attending industry days. They don't do DIU pitches. They aren't filling out SBIRs, and they certainly aren't monitoring SAM.gov. It is only technology data that can open up the rest of the iceberg under the waterline to our national security ecosystem. This data provides information about technology areas and trends, within that, companies that are operating in that space, that are innovating in these technology sectors. And then critical and meaningful insights to understand the trends, to be proactive about sourcing that innovation and bringing it into the market. In this example that you see here, this shows how looking at a patent analysis spanning the years 2013 to 2021, there was a 13% annual growth rate in the area of additive manufacturing, almost all of which was actually driven by explosive growth within industrial manufacturing and smart manufacturing within the industrial space. People data. Talk about things that used to be completely unmanageable. What people data offers is an additional layer of detail and nuance and insight into influences within organizations. So previously we talked about firmographic data and business relationships data that tells you things about an entity itself, whether that's a corporate organization, public or private company, whether it's an academic or research institution. Those areas of influence can go one level deeper when you add in details about the people who are associated with them, and furthermore, the people that are secondarily and at a third level, tertiary level removed from these organizations. One area in particular that we see significant adoption of with respect to commercial data influencing the national security ecosystem is sourcing those multi-layer people connections where those people also have ties to the Chinese Communist Party, or in this case, to Russia. We see examples of individuals being able to evade US and allied sanctions because of changes that they're making in terms of percentage ownership, moving just below a 50% threshold in order to obfuscate connections they have to businesses, and playing a shell game that is impossible to see if you aren't tracking these types of data at a really granular level. None of this data is available in one source. Getting to the point where you have these kinds of insights, where you can surface nefarious behavior like sanctions violations, comes only through integrating multiple sources of data at scale, things like sanctions and prohibited suppliers lists. Everyone in this room knows that over the past few years, decades, infrastructure in the United States has significantly declined. All the while, China is investing tremendously in infrastructure, both locally to them and globally, both physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure. And we're seeing a crisis emerge in terms of inflection points with two very different trend lines. Remember maps like these from the COVID era? Infrastructure data, which highlights areas of particular vulnerability around infrastructure in key locations, critical infrastructure related to resources. Data like that enabled Govini to put together an analysis looking at how infrastructure weaknesses would impact military modernization, power projection, and a third factor, at the onset of a global pandemic, readiness, which makes perfect sense when you think about the impact of infrastructure in this space. Economic data overall is another area that adds detail to what is happening in the national security ecosystem. One cannot simply look at a narrow trend. In this example, we see how macroeconomic data around semiconductors gives us not just a better understanding of risks today, but the ability to look into the future at indicators of risks that might be coming down the line, or future challenges that we may face because of trends. So one example is that the price of semiconductors was actually declining or not rising in pace or in keeping with overall market inflation in the period well leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then that trend continued throughout the pandemic and into 2020. More recently, what we've seen is that semiconductor price inflation is not falling in a way that's commensurate with what we've seen with respect to overall inflation rates decreasing since earlier in 2022. What that kind of trend and those data reveal or surface are particular indications that we could be overly optimistic about production and delivery times, that lead times may continue to be long, and that prices may present a barrier to leveraging this critical technology and these critical components for national security moving forward. This seems like a perfect week to talk about Congress, so I kept this category for last. Policy, legislation, and regulation data includes everything happening within the legislative branch and the regulatory branches of the federal government. It includes congressional transcripts, committee meetings, all of the data published out of our legislative system. And it is the only data that provides an authoritative source of the disconnects between rhetoric and reality on the Hill. One of the most critical factors in US competition with China is putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to the US national security strategy and the US defense strategy. And you rarely hear lawmakers counter the overall priorities that are established in those strategies, or frankly, even the strategies themselves. In fact, we have strong bipartisan agreement on what defense needs to focus on and prioritize in order to effectively counter China and win. And then the budget comes out. And that tells a different story. And the data challenge in following the money and following how Congress actually funds activities related to the stated priorities is a significant one, and it's only solved with this category of data. One small example here with a tremendous impact would be investment in quantum technologies. The budget for quantum technologies in recent years has actually declined, which is baffling when you think about the fact that quantum technologies will play a tremendous role in our future, from a national security perspective, from a humanity perspective, and this is a point that is not lost on China.
Just in conclusion, everything that Tara just walked through is in the document that you have. Those are all real examples from work that we've done in the national security sector, by the way, all unclass, obviously. And maybe my clicker stopped. Is yours working?
I think it's because we're so over time.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll leave you with this. We are hosting a commercial data summit in about 10 days. And because of our relationship with GBEF and EDGE, everyone who's here today gets free admission to the Commercial Data Summit. You can scan the QR code or go to the URL if you can see it. Just put GBEF or EDGE23 in the RSVP code, and you'll automatically get registered and get access. It's a huge event. There are going to be 300 or 400 people there from the national security ecosystem talking about data and the technologies that underpin data. So we hope to see you there, and thank you very much.
Thank you.